Google Classroom, and I will make sure I get back to you with any clarifications. This is going to be the last session, so if you do have doubts, make sure you write into me. Right, let's get going. So today we're going to talk about what are regular and irregular forms. A form, of course, is a three-dimensional object, right, which encloses space. So the words regular and irregular are self-explanatory. So a regular form has easily identifiable or perceivable shape. Irregular forms are generally more organic, are not so familiar. So, right. So the sources are clearly credited, so you can always go and refer it in the future to read more. This is more a summary, so please understand that. Okay, I have somebody who's turned their video on. So yes, thank you. So anyway, so if you have any doubts, make sure you go back and look at the references and kind of read the entire context to get a better understanding. So a regular form refers to those who have a very rigid formation. The geometric sort of pattern will have a set of rules which are identifiable. For example, a square has identical sides, a triangle has 3 sides, a circle has a circumference or a uniform radius, right? Forms, even when they're overlaid, right, can retain their regularity, right? Also, when they're subtracted, if the larger form has, the presence of the larger form is controlled, then it retains its geometric regularity. Irregular forms are those whose parts don't necessarily have a direct correlation. They can be organic, they can be geometric, or it can also be a regular form that is subtracted up to a point where you're no longer able to perceive its regularity. And the last condition at the bottom is when you have an irregular outer form within which regular forms like circles or squares are contained. So this slide kind of covers all the permutations and combinations that you'd probably see when composing shapes. And you need to also bear in mind that form is not just about built form. Built form also encloses voids. Therefore, this also covers the shape of the voids. So regular is not only perceived, irregular is not only perceived in terms of built form, it's also perceived in terms of voids, right? So these are just some examples. Obviously, since the reference is from a book from overseas, these are buildings that we haven't seen. But if you just quickly look at them purely as plans, you notice that the one on the top right has a very regular organization. The one on the bottom left has a more irregular sort of outer boundary with a regular form placed in the center, right? So anyway, to give you 3-dimensional visuals, something that would kind of help you get the idea. So when you look at this building, you notice how the base has a more regular formation and the glass addition has a more irregular form. This is another example of the work of a famous architect named Richard Meyer. And here you notice how regular form itself can be used to create an extremely interesting output. So here you notice it's about the intersection of very formal, rigid, linear geometric shapes. Right. So the next sort of concept that we would be discussing is called transformation of form. Transformation is, of course, the change, right? So form can change. So there are 3 kinds of change that it can undergo. The first is dimensional, right? Dimensional transformation is when there is a change in the dimension of the form. So as you can see in the first set of graphics, the change in either length, breadth, or height, extreme change, will change the way the form is perceived. So the cube can change into a plate, right? Or a pipe. The second type of transformation is subtractive, right? Subtractive, as the word explains, is about removal, right? So you notice how the cube, by the slicing of the volume, can go to even something like a polygon, right? So as the degree of subtraction constantly increases and more of the solid is removed, the identity of the original solid will become more subdued, right? And the last and probably the most common is additive. Additive is basically when you add things together, right? And addition, like subtraction, can go to varying degrees. At the most extreme form, it will become very hard to actually identify the original form from which the addition was begun. So quickly show you a few examples. The first is the Unit d'Habitation by Corbusier, which is a housing complex. That is an example of dimensional transformation. So it's essentially a cube or a rectangle that has been made into a cuboid. The second is an example of a subtractive transformation, and third is an additive. I'm going to be showing you some images so you have visuals of how this looks. Right. So the first is an example of a dimensional transformation, and that shows you how a circle, when it is stretched, right? So when you stretch, you're changing the dimension. In this case, it's along the y-axis, along the x-axis, right? So you're changing the length, and that becomes an oval. Another example is a triangle, right? In a triangle, you can adjust the height, you can adjust, the point, the sort of the vertical, the point where you have the vertical axis. Similarly, a square, right? When you manipulate, squeeze, or extend the dimensions of a square, you end up with different types of rectangles, right? So this is examples of two-dimensional transformation. So I'm going to show you quick examples. This is the Seagram building by Mies van der Rohe. It's a building we've seen many times in class. You notice how it's basically a cube or a cuboid that has been stretched, right? And even the way the facade has been done, or the elevation of the face of the building, you notice the lines accentuate that transformation. The next kind of transformation is subtractive, right? So subtractive transformation can happen in many ways, right? The first and most obvious is, of course, when you have a visual. So, for example, if you have a compound wall which is blocking something, your mind is forced to infer the parts that you cannot see. So that's the first kind of subtraction, but it's the most subdued kind. The next is when you have a very strong volume from which subtraction is done, but the edges and corners are constant, right? So although there is a removal, the identity of the original volume is very strong, so it's still perceivable. So that's the second row of images. The third is where the subtraction is to a higher degree. And in this case, what happens is you have a very strong removal of edges or vertices, and this begins to make it ambiguous of what the original form was. So in this case, it was a cuboid, and you begin to notice that you start seeing it like extruded triangles, right? And the last set of illustrations talk about the subtraction of a square, right? And you keep removing sort of parts of it until a point where it begins to look like an L-shaped form. So clearly, as the degree of subtraction increases, then you begin to face the loss of identity of the original form. So this is a very interesting building, right? I'm trying to show you modern examples to also help you understand that architecture can come from different places. So these principles can be applied even in very modern, cutting-edge buildings, right? So this is a skyscraper in Bangkok, designed by Ole Shareen, and you notice how it's actually a very direct idea of removing, right, from this idea of a pure volume, right? And this takes us back a little bit. This is a beautiful building by Corbusier. It's a house. Here again, you notice how the last building was very solid. This building is more, but both are examples of subtraction. Now, a quick note, Corbusier is, of course, a constant reference, and he had these notes on form, right? So he talks about the 4 ways to do it. One is where you have a cumulative composition, where you kind of add things together, additive. The other is a cubic, where you try and keep pure geometry. The third is the easy one, where it's just basically a cluster, or where you bring things together. And the last is subtractive, right? You have a pure form from which you're removing. So this is sort of Corbusier's quick notes on how you can derive form, and it seemed like an interesting note for all of you to refer, because these lessons that are passed down are good starting points when each of you begins to try designing your own buildings, right? Now we're going to move on to the more exhaustive, which is additive, right? So additive, as you can see in the first diagram, is about bringing things together. Now, obviously, when you bring things together, right, there are many ways in which that relationship of together can be created. When you're subtracting, the actual subtraction doesn't happen unless they touch and there's removal. Whereas addition can happen even when, for example, things are close to each other, right? And that's the first condition, which is spatial tension. That's when two objects aren't really in contact, but are close enough to bear a relation to one another, right? This you can probably connect to what we learned last semester about spatial relationships, right? The next is edge-to-edge contacts. So in that case, you don't have the vertices or the edges. Edges are where two surfaces meet. Now, if an object touches at an edge, you get a very unique sort of additive configuration. The third is where the surfaces or faces touch each other. And as you can see from the diagrams, each of them creates a very different spatial relationship, right? And the last is when the volumes actually interlock. So one kind of goes into the other, but the difference is both remain. In subtraction, when you overlap, one gets removed, right? So I'd like to take it back, and I keep showing this building because it's a very clear reference, and it's something we're all very familiar with, given that it's in our country, right? And you begin to notice how multiple forms have been brought together, right? So you have the base, you have the 4 minarets. Even the minarets are comprised of multiple forms that are kind of added together in a linear sequence, right? And then, of course, all the way culminating to the main dome top, you can actually see it like a kit of parts that has been added. And that, in a sense, is an additive composition or transformation. Now, additive transformation can be done in many ways. So there are 5 sort of specific ways in which you generally see them done. The first is a centralized form, right? So it's when you have a primary form in the middle and a number of central forms that are arranged around it. It's generally very regular and organized, so it's not random, right? A linear form is when things are laid out along a line. This diagram shows you a straight line, but lines need not be necessarily straight. Radial form is when you have a focus center with outward flowing forms, multiple outward flowing linear forms. A cluster form is when you have a more randomized sort of arrangement of forms, and you don't necessarily need a focus, right? And the last is, of course, a grid form. A grid form is an organized cluster. So you have rows, columns, and of course, if it's extended into 3D, then you have a third dimension. Right. So the first type is a centralized form, right? A centralized form generally means you have a very organized geometric arrangement. And obviously, you'll need a necessarily axial condition. It generally would be accompanied by symmetry, because symmetry would reinforce an axial condition, right? So as you can notice that, there are 2 ways in which this can be done. One is when you have a prominent form in the center, or you have a prominent void. So both will highlight the centralized sort of configuration, right? That centralized form will need to have sort of self-centering, because it kind of gathers what is called the visual thrust, or the sort of the focus of everyone's attention. So it will generally be highly geometric, regular, symmetrical, right? As seen in the images here. But just remember, it can be both solid and void, right? So the example I'm showing is Villa Rotunda by Palladio, right? And you can notice how It's very geometrically solid, highly symmetrical, and even in terms of hierarchy, the actual point where you have the most visual focus, or the thrust is focused, is on the dome or cupola, which is in the center. Right? This is the opposite. It's actually a void, and you notice how, although the building wraps all around, your focus is on the courtyard, right? So a centralized form can be both solid and void, and both can be equally powerful, right? So here, the courtyard ends up being the focus. Okay. Right. The next thing is a linear form, right? So a linear form can be got by extending a form along one direction. You get a long, a linear configuration. The second is where you have smaller forms, which are all arranged along a line, right? So something like a train, right? A train of forms. Now just remember that this linear sequence can also relate to a curve, right? So it's not necessarily about putting it out along a line. It can also respond to a curve. It can also kind of create the focus to something that lies beyond, right? So almost like defining a gateway or a viewpoint. Then linear forms can also enclose form, which is what you see in the fourth. So if it kind of bends around, then it encloses a form in the center, right? Linear form can also work vertically, right? And it can also be the organizing element. So it could be the axis along which a number of irregular forms are kind of organized, right? Right. So the first example is the Lingaraja temple in Bhubaneswar, right? You saw the plan earlier where it's basically a sequence of. You also notice that it kind of modulates in height. Radial, like the word suggests, has something to do with radius. So there's obviously a center, right? And from the center, you have radiating arms, multiple arms, right? If it was only a single point, then it becomes centralized, right? And the difference between centralized and radial is, of course, centralized is inward looking and radial is outward. So generally, the central point will be either the symbolic or functional center of the configuration. And when you combine multiple radial forms, you could also extend it into a network, right, which is shown in the bottom left. So this is a very famous example. It's by Marcel Breuer. It's a UNESCO building, right? And you can very distinctly see the three radiating arms from a common central core, right? A more contemporary example, and something we've seen in the last session also, is the Khalifa, the Burj Khalifa. So when you look at it as a completed building, you don't actually perceive it. But when you look at the plan, you begin to notice how it has a very strong radial arrangement. And what's interesting is this radial arrangement kind of extends outwards as you move towards the base. And as you go towards the top, it culminates and actually becomes the center. So it's a very dynamic radial form, right? Because in vertical, along the vertical height, the arms actually extend as you move downwards. Right. The next is clustered form. So first, let's try and differentiate what a clustered form is as against a centralized form, right? So centralized form is highly organized. It's highly geometric. You have a central form that kind of anchors the composition. And for it to be identifiable, it has to have a very organized layout. So it's not extremely dexterous, or it's not very easily maneuverable. Whereas a clustered form is a little more maneuverable, because it's about objects relating organically by proximity. So a clustered form can be created by objects being close to each other or touching. It can also be related by proximity, so which means it doesn't touch, but they're very close to each other. And lastly, it's also created by interlocking. And since clustered is more organic, you don't need equal weightage of the forms that are arranged. You don't necessarily need an anchoring, focus. The hierarchy can vary, and it's just far more flexible, right? Now, I'd like you to also notice below that you can have a clustered form with congruent shapes. Congruent shapes are shapes that are identical in size and, they're basically identical shapes. So the first example that comes to mind is a beehive, right? You'll notice it's made up of hexagons, right? So that is a good example of a clustered form, right? Okay. So in architecture, I think we saw these houses. These are the vernacular houses of Rajasthan. And you notice how it has a cluster of multiple huts around a courtyard. This is a great example of clustered form because depending on the context and the setting, the cluster would not a typical standardized. The last kind is a grid form, right? We all know what a grid is. It's exactly what you have in a grid notebook. It's basically vertical and horizontal lines, right? Of regular or irregular spacing. And if you extend this vertically, you will get a spatial field, right? And you can place objects in this spatial field, create a highly organized three-dimensional grid, right? So there are some very interesting examples of this. One is the capsule building in Tokyo, and the other, which is a little more informal, is the habitat building by Moshe Safdie. I think this is in Israel. You notice how there's a very strong feeling of a grid and of course subtraction from it. Hence this one where you have a centralized element onto which it feels like these pods have been added. And the interesting thing about this particular building, it was conceived as a building that could always evolve. So each of those, it's a hotel, and each of those blocks you see are pods or rooms. And the idea was over the lifetime of the hotel, they could always detach those pods and add newer versions of it. So very cutting edge thoughts for its time. So we're now going to move into the next topic, which is collisions of geometry, right? So a collision is when two objects come into contact. So that also happens in geometry. So when you worked on design, you will notice that you're constantly trying to overlay shapes. You're trying to make them touch, right? So this process is, essentially collisions. So there is some science or theory behind this, which we're going to try and look at. Okay, so collisions can happen across any form, right? So regular, irregular, there are no rules to it. I think you're going to study the theory behind it using a few examples, right? One, of course, is pure form. In this case, it's being represented by the circle and square. And the second is in terms of orientation, which is being represented by the idea of a rotated grid, right? But please remember, a circle can be replaced by a triangle, a square can be replaced by a rectangle. So this theory can be extrapolated across any shape, right? Organic or inorganic. A rotated grid basically talks about orientation. So it's not just a grid, it's about rotation. This is currently restricted to 2 dimensions, but it can also be done 3-dimensionally, right? So the first case, you have 2 forms, right, which are overlaid one over the other. And when that happens, you begin to see the identity of the overlaid form. So in this case, you begin to see something like a star, right? In the second case, one sort of shape is much larger than the other. So it kind of accepts the smaller shape. So it's either the question on the third set of images on the extreme left, you notice how you would describe it as a small circle inside a square, or the next is a small square inside a circle, right? Similarly, with a rotated grid, what happens is due to the change in the orientation, you begin to see it differently. So you basically see the rotated square as a diamond, right? So in the first, you see a small diamond inside a larger square. In the second, you see a small square inside the larger diamond, right? And always remember, there is a huge variable in this, which is the observer, right? So currently, the way you're looking at it, it looks a certain way. Now, if you were to move or you were to rotate the screen, then your perception of the entire sort of the composition would change, right? The third is when you actually have an intersection, right? So the two forms retain their identities, but they also share the portion of intersection or the interlock, right? The last is where you have two distinct forms that are connected by a connecting element. And this connection can happen either linearly, off grid, off axis, or along a diagonal axis. So these are just some ways in which forms can be got to interact, right? Now, in these instances, it's a question of two, but you can have multiple forms that collide, right? Okay, so in this slide, it talks about sort of situations in which you have these collisions of geometry. So the first is where you're trying to highlight an interior space. So you kind of overlay multiple shapes to create unique spatial experiences, right? Or to highlight something. So in the first, you have the idea of a circle inside a square, right? You might notice things like this being done in temples or spiritual sort of spaces where you're trying to create a unique experience within. And others where you're trying to highlight a space within a larger space, so you kind of rotate it, right? And the last is where you overlay, almost like a maze. The next is when you have, a space that is reacting towards a specific condition. So you're forced to turn or rotate a space within a larger composition to react to a certain, view or activity that happens in front of it. Or you could have obstacle, right? And therefore you have to cut your build form out to accommodate that obstacle or interruption, right? And the last is, of course, when you're responding to structure, right? So every building has a certain structure, and your building can react to that. So the structural sort of composition can be rotated to the actual build form, right? So in this case, you notice the lines of the structure are at 45 degrees or rotated to the actual build form, right? And the last row of diagrams, on the extreme left, it talks about trying to highlight a symmetrical condition within a larger form. And in that case, you have collision of form. The next is when it reacts to like a natural setting, it could be a hill, boulder, right? And therefore you have subtraction. And the third is for movement, right? So when you have movement and your building is reacting to parts of movement within the larger setting, sometimes you'll need to cut, for example, a passage through a building. And this is another example of collisions of geometry, right? So these are sort of built examples. On the top, you have examples where you have rectangular or square forms that have been placed inside a circle. This is a very interesting slide to kind of note because it shows you how you can resolve curved form with straight lines, right? Very often I find students struggling with the idea of working with curves. They think if their building is curved, then all the elements in the building need to be curved, right? But if you notice, most architects would use a combination of the two, right? So this exercise is very interesting for you because you can begin to realize that you can have a nice mix of linear and curves, right? And also circle, by virtue of the way it is capable of being the central focus or the organizing element. So it can kind of accept and organize multiple forms as seen in the image on the bottom left, right? Okay. The next is, of course, you notice on the top left, you notice how you have rotated squares around set within a circle. And below that, you notice the plan of a roof form, right? So these inspirations can affect not just the build form, it can also affect how the structure is derived. Right? So the idea of a rotated grid can be used to derive structure, it can be used to derive form. The image on the top right, you notice how the interior of the building is rotated from the axis, the linear axis of the exterior, right? So that creates a very unique composition. The bottom left, you have a tower that twists, right? And this is a very interesting idea, and particularly in modern skyscrapers, it's used very often. where the flow plate kind of twists as you go up. It creates a very interesting curvilinear motion. So in this instance, these are the applications of a rotated grid in the derivation of form. Now we move on to another topic. It's called articulation of form. Articulation is something we've spoken about in the past. Articulation basically means to express, right? So how do you express form? You express it by its elements, which are basically the point, line, and plane, right? Right. So on the left, you have form that is being expressed, right? So if you highlight the lines, it highlights the form. If you highlight the planes, it highlights the form. You can highlight the edges, and that also highlights a form. Or you can highlight the surfaces by either using light and shade or different materials. So all these sort of methodologies will highlight the overall form or the weight of the object, right? Now, if you were to take the contrarian approach or the opposite approach, can you break form? Can you break the edges and corners? You can do that by highlighting the form, right? What do I mean by that? As the edges and corners disappear, right? The form becomes more obvious, right? So in the top right, on the right hand side, you notice how by uniformly treating all the surfaces, right, the edges slowly begin to disappear. Bottom left, you notice how they use a pattern, right? And by using a pattern, they are breaking the edges, right? And the last is where you make the vertices disappear, right? And the minute you do that, you'll begin to notice this form begins to appear softer. So another way to do it is to round the corners. The minute you do that, you stop seeing it as a sharp angular object, but start seeing it more as a round, softer object. So a good example will be a cuboid as against a cylinder, or a cone versus a pyramid. A pyramid is far more angular. The edges are very discernible, whereas in a cone, you get a much softer surface. Okay, so surfaces, right, are perceived by the eye using material, right, and also by edges. So if you had a surface where the edges were not very distinct, you will perceive it as a single. So if you took a piece of paper and you looked at it, you'll see it as a single surface. If you folded it lightly, right, you'll still see it as a surface. If you curved it, you'll still see it as a surface. But if you folded it over and creased it, you'll begin to see two surfaces, right? Now, if after creasing it, you still keep a very shallow angle, you still might perceive it as a single surface, right? Also, if you crease it and then you treat it with a similar pattern or a continuing pattern like the A, which is folded across two surfaces, then the surface gets subdued, right? Also, the perception of the degree of surfaces or the identity of surfaces will increase as the sort of point of intersection of the edge of the vertex becomes more acute or sharp, right? So that is what is illustrated in the bottom set of images. So corners occur where two or more surfaces meet. The first example is a very obvious instance where you have two surfaces that meet at 90 degrees, right? The minute you do that, you have a very sharp edge that is perceived. It also depends on where you're standing relative to this edge. So if you're standing in front of one surface and straight on, then you're not going to read the second surface. So you'll just see the outline of a shape. Okay, we're going to take a quick break while you do the poll. We're good to go. Let's continue. The poll is done. Right. So the second instance is where you round a corner, right? When I say round a corner, it's not smoothing it off, but you have a linear element that defines the corner. The minute you do that, right, you begin to notice the corner as an independent element, right? The third is where the two surfaces actually don't meet because the corner disappears. In this case, it looks like one surface actually leads over the other. Basically the one that wasn't wiped out. The third instance is where the corner is actually erased, right? The minute you do that, what happens? The space from inside begins to leak outwards, right? So when you're standing outside and you look at it, it feels like it kind of blends into the interior. The last is when you round the corner, that is the two surfaces meet. And here the crucial parameter is the radius of curvature. So as the radius gets larger, then the feeling of solidness would increase, right? Right. So just to give you quick examples, you notice the diagram there. It shows you how the corner happens. So in the first, you have a clean corner. In the second, you have an overlap. Right? And there are images showing the junctions. Right? So in real life, this is how it looks. If you look at that vertical tower that you see, this is the Johnson Wax building by Frank Lloyd Wright. You see the vertical tower, you can notice how the corner is completely rounded off. And the minute you do that, it feels very solid and chunky. You don't see the individual surfaces. It feels like a ribbon that's wrapping around. So this is a great example of a rounded. Right? In this case, this is the Kaufman House by Richard Neutra. And you notice how, if you look at that open window where you can see the armchair, you notice how it feels like the exterior is leaking into the interior. So this is an example where the corner has been erased. Right. This is an example of the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe. Here again, you notice how the corner is completely erased. It feels like the exterior kind of leaks and enters into the interior. Right. Now, surfaces are very interesting because it's how we perceive, buildings, right? So surfaces, of course, are perceived by the texture, color, the material that is used. So if there's a distinct contrast between two surfaces, then they begin to stand out. Also, sometimes it depends on where you're looking at it from, right? So with the change in the position of the observer, the pattern or the surface, the perception of the surface changes. Scale of a surface is sometimes understood from the by a reference. So for example, a human being or a door would help you get an idea of the scale of the surface. Texture and color together affect the visual weight. And lastly, the use of pattern, right? So application of pattern can articulate a surface very uniquely, right? So quickly to show you different examples, you look at the example of the bottom right, you notice how those lines make the building look very chunky. On top right, you notice the building where you have horizontal lines, it breaks the verticality of the building. And on the left, you have more conventional buildings, but you notice how the treatment begins to make it look layered like a cake. Right. So now we're going to move into the last bit of this session, which is about analyzing space. Analyzing means to kind of scrutinize, understand, and see why something is the way it is, right? So there are two ways in which we experience space, spatial and visual. So if you walk through a space, right, you're looking at it. So you're taking in what you see, right? But as you walk through, your body is also experiencing it. So for example, you measure the space by the number of steps you took. So in a small room, you'll take fewer steps. In a large room, you'll take more steps, right? So your mind is creating a visual map as well as a physical map. It's almost like it's mapping the space, right? So as you navigate it and then you come out, later in life, you'll have this sort of recollection of, for example, how big your classroom is, how wide, right? You'll remember visually, okay, that it was that far. but then you'll also remember walking and say, oh, it took me about, 15 seconds to walk the width, and it took me about 40 seconds to walk the length. So the ratio is about, 2.5 times, right? So your mind is constantly doing this correlation of visual and spatial, right? So the first way you analyze the spatial quality is this, spatial and visual. So I'm going to introduce you to this new term, which is the idea of spatiality. Right? Spatiality means sense of space, right? So in that you notice things like symmetry, asymmetry, scale, which is relative or absolute, bearing and being born, and porosity, right? So let's look at symmetry. So symmetrical spaces generally create a sense of monumentality. It has a perfect reflection, and you have a strong sense of axis. Asymmetrical spaces are less monumental, they're more organic and more informal, and they have more variation and dynamism, right? Scale can be relative because absolute scale is where you walk in and your relation to the space is subdued as against the relationship of the space to either larger enveloping space or an element within, right? So absolute scale is best used when the user can experience a large object and slowly approach it, fully understanding its vastness. Variation in scale are best used in section, right? So, for example, when you walk into a bathroom and it has a low ceiling, and then you come out and there's a large lobby, right? Entering narrow passageways and then entering a large expansive space will give you a very strong sense of this relative and absolute scale. Bearing and being born basically means when either a space bears another space, or being born is where it's held by something. So like a viewing tower is the case of a space that is being born, whereas a platform or a stage is the example of a bearing space, right? Porosity talks about the skin, right? So a more porous space will have more visual continuity with the outside. A less porous space will have less visual continuity with the outside. Right? So let's get into what are spatial qualities, right? So spatial qualities, I would broadly categorize them as 5. The first is proportion, right? The second is scale. The third is definition. The fourth is degree of enclosure. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6. The fifth is light, and the sixth is views, right? These all work hand in hand, right? So proportion and scale are deeply related to each other. Definition, degree of enclosure go together because the more the degree of enclosure, the higher the definition, right? Material affects both light and views. Views will affect the degree of enclosure, because if you had wonderful expansive views, then you'll want a less enclosed space, larger windows, right? If you had larger windows, you're going to have more light, right? So each of these spatial qualities depends on the other to define the space that is there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few buildings that I've presented to you before, right? In our case, it'll be pavilions, since you're currently working at the scale. And I'd like you to quickly take notes on sort of these 6 spatial qualities and how it's been used in those examples, right? I'm also going to give you, these are 3 terms that were connected by this French architect called Bernard Tschumi. It's called concept, context, and content, right? A concept is sort of the idea behind the building. Context is where it's set, and it's the cultural, economic, and historical context. Content is what it's made of and what is inside, right? So most buildings can be described by these 3 components. So I'd like you to pay attention to this when you sort of look at these buildings that I'm going to be presenting next. Right? Yeah. The last thing is the idea of tectonics, right? So what is tectonics? You have 2 buildings here. The one on the left is a conventional building, right? And the one on the right is actually an older building, but a little more unconventional, right? So when you look at it, there's a very strong difference in perception on the building, right? One strikes you instantly. Right? So tectonics has something to do with that. It's about how a building is made, how a building is also perceived, right? So the building on the right is the Pompidou Center in France. It's a museum. And the interesting thing here is they talk about the timelessness of the building. So they felt a building outlasts the technology inside it. So the idea was to bring the technology to the outside, which means it could easily be removed and replaced. So this was, I think it was called high tech, the style, and it was championed by Richard Rogers and Norman Foster, who are extremely famous now. On the left is a more conventional building where the technology all gets hidden inside, right? These are also retrofitted, but it's a little harder because you have to actually go in and skin the building, right? So tectonics in architecture is defined as a science or art of construction, both in relation to use and artistic design. It refers not just to the activity of making the materially requisite construction that answers certain needs, but rather to the activity that raises its construction to an art form. It is concerned with the modeling of material to bring the material into presence from the physical into the metaphysical world, right? I'm going to show you, the example that I think you should carry in your mind, right? And then I'll come back and try and explain this to you, in simpler terms. Right? I'm going to go back to a building that I'm very fond of, the Taj Mahal, right? So the Taj Mahal is essentially made of, brick, mortar, lime mortar, marble, right? But we rarely describe it that way, right? We don't say that marble building. Instead, we describe it as a monument of love. Obviously, there is historical context and the purpose for which it was built, but the architecture has complemented that, right? So anytime you look at it, there is this larger meaning of a memorial, right? Also, the idea of capturing the relationship between, Shah Jahan and Mumtaz, right? So tectonics is that. Tectonics is not just what was used to build it, it is also capturing the essence or the emotion behind the building. Right, so to quickly walk you through more contemporary examples, the first one we're going to look at is the work of an architect I greatly admire, Toyo Ito. He's Japanese, right? And he approaches it highly geometrically, right? So for him, his concept is very deeply rooted in geometry, right? The building of the Serpentine Pavilion, I've already told you, this built in London. It's a temporary pavilion that's constantly removed. This is the building, right? I'm going to talk to you about, and also what's interesting is the context is constant, right? The content is constant, but the concept over the last 20 years has changed as each architect has done it. So you notice how with the same site, you can do multiple things just because you approach it differently, right? So just to quickly give you a connection, that's Toyo Ito. His architecture in general is highly geometrical and it works on the exploration of structure. And you notice how this building is true to his overall philosophy, right? Uses different materials, but the philosophy is constant, right? Which is the idea of a style. So if you remember earlier, the idea of rotation, right? Rotated grid, that is the basis. And it's also a collision of geometry where you're using different sizes of squares and rotating it. And this was the essence of the derivation of the structure and the overall form. So there was basically the square was rotated, the lines were extended, right, to create a skin of metallic elements, bent, and then folded over to create a three-dimensional form. On top, you notice the spiral. That was the sort of the algorithm or rules, set of rules that helped resolve this structural concept, right? So it was bent over and then pockets were cut out to create visual porosity, right? And then it got assembled as separate elements that were brought to site and bolted on. So this is sort of the elevation. The hatched bits are solid, the white bits are porous, right? And look at the visual porosity you get when it's completed, right? So there's sort of a seamlessness of inside and outside. You notice how edges are prominent, but you also have porous openings that kind of help the inside merge with the outside. The second building approaches things a little different. It's also a pavilion. It's a British pavilion for the World Expo, designed by this very famous architect called Thomas Heatherwick. And here, his concept was to capture the idea of the world, right? And he did that by using the idea of seeds. So the building was called the Seed Cathedral. It basically had seeds at the tip, at the edges of acrylic rods, right? And this is what the building looked at. So the acrylic rods would conduct light, and also because they stretched so far out, they would move in the breeze, so it looked like a plant, right, or a seed. Inside, it was a completely dark environment, and the acrylic rods kind of carried the light and lit the seeds that were put on the edge, which is why it's called the seed cathedral. And this is sort of the overall plan. Again, you notice how you have a highly organized form, but it's placed off center, right? The shape is rounded, right? So compositionally, you begin notice, and the sort of the base is highly fragmented and deflected, right? And you notice how it creates a very dynamic relationship between the two forms. So you have a curved form placed on an angular form, and the contrast helps one stand out from the other. Right? And this is the building in section. I want you to also look at how outside you have a very rounded, regular form, and on the inside you have an irregular form. So these collisions of geometry, these relationships that we talk about are not just applied in plan, they can also be done section and three-dimensionally. Right, so to quickly give you takeaways, so some of the additional material is, there are two interesting YouTube videos. One is on tectonics, right? And the second is on the idea of a material and its application. Right? So I would encourage you to go watch this. I will, of course, be posting the PDF of these class slides on the Google Classroom, so you can always click it there, right? And to quickly give you the recommended reading for Unit 3, reading Form, Space and Order by D.K. Ching should be more than sufficient. I hope you've all referred that. For Unit 4, you will have to draw on your own experiences from Design Studio, and also the links that I've just shared now, right? And the recommended reading that was there in your syllabus. So if you're not able to access those books, then please go online. There aren't ready-made sort of books that I